Hello, BookTube. It's a bleak and barren Wednesday here in the United States, for the simple reason that today is our Independence Day. The 4th of July is our Independence Day here in America, one of the two national holidays on our calendar that I actually take seriously and that I actually feel a deep sentimental connection to, which prompted me to go and I have two rituals that I do on the 4th of July. I go out early to do them because it's usually very hot. Today it's very hot. And they took up most of the day. They featured wonderful memories, some old friends, being out and about in the sun. And that part was wonderful. But coming back, I realized that in addition to all of that wonderful stuff about a holiday that I love, about a country that I love, there's also the bleak and barren part, because there's no mail on the 4th of July. So to console myself, as per usual, I'm doing a tag. And I made a tag myself for the occasion. It's the U.S. Independence Day book tag. It's 10 prompts. I've got some props here to show you so you're not just staring at my nose the whole time. While we go through the Founding Fathers and one Founding Mother. Starting, of course, with George Washington. And the question is, the most overrated book that you have ever read. And for me, that would be Ulysses by James Joyce. The darling of idolaters everywhere and the subject of endless seas of commentary, and yet a bad, boring book. Question number 2 would be John Adams, the most argumentative book you've ever read. And for modern audiences, that would have to be this, A Reader's Manifesto by B.R. Myers, in which he surveys the state of contemporary literature. This is from about 15 or 20 years ago. And lays waste to it all. Just slams wonderful, delicious haymakers and sharp elbows in all directions, taking down all the literary sacred cows of the day. In prose that's wonderful, in sarcasm that's just as dry as ice. I loved it from beginning to end. I, of course, rejoice in the long sections where he just dismantles writers like Paul Auster or Cormac McCarthy. But I also love just the general purpose. This is an expanded version of an article that he did, and the expansions of the book make it, where he gives rules for sententious authors. He spots patterns and parallels that even I had not seen in decades of hating these authors. And it will start an argument, no matter where you stand on these authors, because sooner or later, and even in the course of such a small book, he is bound to pick on someone you like. He does pick on an author that I like in this book, and it made me argue with him, but in the best possible way. Prompt number 3 is Samuel Adams, the most underrated book you've ever read. And for me, that would have to be a modern of American literature, a modern classic, and that is Moontusk by Bruce Grether, which is a book featuring strapping, hairy men pawing all over each other. It features a race of telepathic mastodons, and the moon up in the sky has a ring around it. Not going to belabor the semiotics, I'll just repeat that. The moon in the sky has a ring around it. And we'll move on from there. It's tough. Moontusk is a tough act to follow, but we'll move on to prompt number 4, Abigail Adams. A secondary character who could have handled things better than most of the main characters. The drama that I want to use here is not fiction. It's nonfiction. It's the drama of World War II. And when you call to mind the drama of World War II, you immediately think a handful of indispensable people, one of whom is certainly Winston Churchill. And I don't agree with that. I've never agreed with that. I think World War II could have been prosecuted the same or better by any number of people in the British ruling class, including a couple of people in Churchill's own cabinet. And the candidate I have in mind today is John Anderson, Viscount Waverley, who had a clear eye to the dangers that Britain was in, a clear eye to the dangers of its allies, a clear eye to the way to prosecute the war, the way forward, and who wasn't. He had a very sound grasp of tactics and strategy, but he was not slurring his words, falling down drunk every single day. He wasn't drunk every single day. And so I often think, well, how would World War II have played out if he had been in charge? And if someone, a government minister, a high government minister, who was visibly, audibly known to be falling out of his chair drunk every single day, had been, instead of elevated to the premiership, dismissed from public service. Of course, in any other branch of public service anywhere in the world, if you had an employee who was falling out of his chair drunk every day, you would dismiss him. You would fire him. You wouldn't keep him on. It wouldn't be seen as a character thing, especially if he's handling classified information. I have often wondered, if John Anderson had been in charge, how many farces would not have happened? How many ill-thought plans and campaigns would not have happened in World War II? I often wonder what post-war Britain would have been like if with a different prime minister. So that's my Abigail Adams for this scenario. Prompt number 5 is Thomas Jefferson, and that is the most hypocritical book you've ever read. And for right now, my answer holds, as it has for 40 years, and that is R.N., the memoirs of President Richard Nixon. I'm gathering that quite a few of you don't remember Nixon and would have to know him through biographies or Wikipedia. But in his memoir, R.N., he sings the praises of, he extols all of the values that when he was in office, he, to paraphrase Mark Twain, flung down and danced upon. It was an act of such hypocritical effrontery that I honestly didn't know how professional critics of the day were reviewing it without simply typing a stream of obscenities onto the page. I don't know how they did it. I couldn't have done it. And the reason that it's temporary is because the current occupant of the White House will certainly have a memoir ghostwritten for him. And I can only assume that it will be worse, that it will be a memoir about how really I wanted to be tough, but I wanted to be my administration to be an administration of love for everyone. While I dispossess half the country, while I strip women and minorities of their basic civil rights in this country, and while I keep immigrant babies in chain-link cages. I'm assuming that those memoirs will be much worse, but I could be wrong. They might never get written. So right now, R.N. holds the title. Prompt number 6 is Benjamin Franklin. Who is the book by the oldest author you've ever read? Still living, I mean, not the Book of Job. And for me, that would be Herman Wouk. I think that would be Herman Wouk for almost everybody. He's like 190 years old. Went to school with Abraham Lincoln, and he still writes books, and they are cogent. They are actually well written. I don't know how he's in his second century, and he still writes books. I've read the last couple, expecting to see a total attenuation of his mental powers. This was a very, very good author. Herman Wouk does not get the credit that he deserves as a 20th century novelist. That might change, but right now he doesn't. And I kept expecting these things would be dawdles, and no, they're not. So he gets the prize. Then prompt number 7 is Alexander Hamilton. And this is the least charismatic but important book you've ever read. And for me, that would be Origin of the Species by Charles Darwin, which has those beautiful rounded Victorian periods of prose all throughout. It is a glorious thing to read, but it is not demonstrative. It takes you a while to get into the right historical mind frame when you're reading and suddenly take a step back and realize what is actually being proposed in this book. At which point you see the absolutely Nagasaki-sized explosion of what's in these well-mannered, very mild-mannered pages. So it's not a charismatic book at all. There were far more charismatic tracts that were written right around the same time on other subjects that don't really have anything but hot air in them. Whereas Darwin buttons it down completely. He battens down everything in order to divulge, in order to disseminate to a reading public a theory that was as revolutionary as anything could be. Reading it still gives me chills, but only when I think about it. It's not trying to give me chills. And then prompt number 8 is the obverse. It's John Hancock, the most charismatic but least important book that you've read. And for me, that is this, The Pillow Book of Sei Shonagon, which is an absolute, a bright, glittery soap bubble of nothing. It's lists of inanities. It's silly, vapid thoughts by a group of silly, vapid young women. It's amazing to me that it's a classic of Japanese literature. It's absolutely bewitching to read. But it's about nothing in the absolute basic definition of the word. And it's amazing to me to think that this book came out of the same court and the same friendship circle as the Tale of Genji. Reading them together is just amazing. I wish that that this book got the translation and edition love that Genji gets. We really ought to have a beautiful Penguin Classic Deluxe edition of, say, Shonagon, like we've had of Genji for 10, 20 years now. But one way or another, if you see it and you're wondering if it's any good and you're thinking, oh, you know, classic Japanese literature is so powerful and moving and profound, you should definitely get it and you should definitely read it, but those expectations will be destroyed. This is not powerful or moving or profound. And then prompt number 9 is Paul Revere, and this is a book that alerted you to something. And the classic answer for a long time for me was, as I suspect for a lot of people of a certain time, was Silent Spring by Rachel Carson, her book about the horrible cost that isn't exactly visible that the natural world is paying for advances in human comfort and convenience in human industry. It felt like, I'm sure there were voices crying in the wilderness before her, but it felt like an incredible wake-up call to a whole generation. That if you keep going on the way you are without regulating yourself, there's not going to be anything of this left for your grandchildren in the natural world. Rereading the book, Library of America just brought it out a little while ago, and I reread it and recaptured all those memories of how utterly urgent it felt. What a real pulling the blanket off a blind spot. But for modern times, it'd be this, Worm by Mark Bowden, which is subtitled The First Digital World War, and which is about the discovery and the examination and the attempts to thwart the Conficker virus, the Conficker computer virus, that Bowden is a beautiful writer. It's a beautifully written book. It's just entrancing. The way that he explains things that you can tell would be poorly handled in another writer's treatment are done. It's just amazing how much you learn from the book, but it also woke me up to cyber threats, just in general. It's possible now to look back at the Conficker virus and think, well, yeah, that was early days. That in some ways looks primitive, which is horrifying. And also the whole attitude that I had, and I suspect a lot of people did before this, and for instance, Clifford Stoll's book, The Cuckoo's Egg, a lot of us probably had the idea that the bad actors on the internet were hackers. You know, idle kids with tons and tons of technical expertise and too much time on their hands looking to play pranks, embarrass public figures or public corporations, that sort of thing. This was a wake-up call to me that those are actually the smallest fringe players in what is a gigantic military complex of attacks and counterattacks that are just horrifying. To think what would happen, what will certainly happen in our lifetime if someone attacks the internet. I mean, just in the last week, America, huge parts of America have had incredibly crawlingly slow internet service, or none at all. And the explanations that have been put forward have been contradictory, and the least convincing of them has been that it's some sort of massive cable problem with a service provider. But the other explanation that's been going on all along is that it's hacker related. And not state-sponsored, just relatively individual, but hugely widespread. And you imagine what would happen with a larger version of that. I mean, just picture this week in America. In America this week, almost every part of the country has been baking in record heat. So huge numbers of people in hospitals, in nursing homes, even in houses with babies or small children or elderly relatives or even just normal people. Huge numbers of people in this country have been relying on the electrical grid for air conditioning, because it's still boiling hot even at midnight. And imagine if that were taken out. Huge numbers of people, virtually everyone in the country, relies on the internet in some way or other. Imagine if that were attacked. And it's books like this. This is one I highly recommend if you see it, because with Mark Bowden you can't go wrong. But books like this really woke me up to the potentials there, and they're devastating. And then prompt number 10 is James Madison, the smartest, boring book you've ever read. And for me, that would be The Rise of the West by William McNeill, a gigantic tome of a thing that's a huge 1,000-page history of Western civilization from the very beginning all the way to the present day, just crawling along with tremendous erudition and tremendous research, huge bibliography, and not the slightest bit of writerly ability in terms of storytelling. So it's rock solid and rock exciting. And I imagine you all have different candidates for that, but for me, when I see The Rise of the West at the Brattle Bookshop here in Boston or somewhere else, I see a copy for $1, I'm always tempted, and I always have the same thought, which is that, I wish I liked it more than I do. And that is it. That is the U.S. Independence Day book tag. And all that's left is for me to tag some patriotic fellow Americans. I tag Wilsonn and Lukash and Mark at Richardson Reads, of course, since we're all grateful for your service in the Green Mountain Boys. And I also tag Britta and Roz and Leah at Hyde and Seek, all good, upstanding American citizens, to feel free to do this. And now I'm going to relax into my day. Thanks to the wonders of the aforementioned internet technology, I'm going to watch the Boston Pops concert on the Esplanade without actually going down into the crowds in 100-degree weather. It used to be that I would sometimes be talked into doing that. Occasionally I went for the far better alternative of, if, like, for instance, a friend of mine was running an equity group in an office building in downtown Boston, and just let me and a couple of other friends onto his deserted floor at night in order to go to the windows and have some champagne and have some food and watch the fireworks in air conditioning. And then a couple of other times I had an invitation to go to a rooftop on Beacon Hill, which had a perfect vantage point. You just look down onto the river, where thousands of people have gathered all day in order to watch the Pops come out and play. The Pops play a selection of popular tunes. They have all sorts of talks and celebrities, and then they finish things up with the 1812 Overture played with real cannons. And it's a tradition, and it really is satisfying, but I hate the idea of going. Because when the tradition's over, you then have to deal with 18,000 drunk people all wanting to leave at the same time. It's just a nightmare. It's not worth it, especially when it's this hot. So thanks to the internet, I can just watch a live cast and be done with it that way. And then, once this bleak and barren 4th of July Wednesday is over, then I will get to see. This is the one piece of curiosity I have left in this week, is what is the rest of the week going to be like? Is anybody going to come back to work on Thursday and Friday? Is anybody going to do anything on Thursday and Friday? Am I going to get mail? Is traffic going to resume on Hyde Park Ave? There's no traffic whatsoever. Walk Hill, no cars of any kind. All the way into the center of town, no cars at all. No traffic whatsoever. You can just wander across the street, 4 lanes, without worrying about looking. Is that going to change? Are people going to come back? I know some basics. The bodegas play a very hard game. They will be back open. Dunkin' Donuts, of course, will be open. But the rest, I'm dying to see what it'll be like. But that's tomorrow. Today I'm going to cool off because I was out in the sun all morning, and I'm not used to that. And I'm just going to hang out with the puppy and do some writing and reading. So, of course, I wish you a happy 4th of July. I'm hoping that you're spending it in the absolute classic ways that Americans tend to spend this day. They do not famously line up for compulsory attendance at military parades. Instead, they have somewhat silly parades, and they line up for barbecues and cookouts and beach visits with friends and whatnot. And the pictures that flood onto social media are wonderful. The pictures that flood onto social media at the 4th of July are what this country is all about. So I'm hoping that I see a lot of that. I'm hoping you're all partaking of it. But in the meantime, I'm going to go. But I will see you tomorrow. Thank you, BookTube.